Well, hello everybody. Welcome to another week of our Bible study. I was really hoping for us to be back in person again, but it seems like the weather has had different different opinions than us, so to say, the past couple of weeks. But that's all right. We can still meet online. Um, I'm looking forward to when we can get back in person, and as soon as we're able to, as soon as the weather permits, we will. But for now, I guess this is what we'll be blessed with. So before we break into this, let's start with a word of prayer. Lord, even though it's frustrating for us not to be able to meet in person, we want to thank you for letting us be able to have means from which to be able to hear your word anyway. Lord, we know it's not the same. It's not a substitute. But Lord, it's still helpful and it's still good. We'd ask that you please bless this reading of your holy word today. Please let everybody come away with something with it. This week we're going to delve into some interesting topics, Lord, and I'd ask that you please lay it on people's hearts. Lord, if they have questions, let them ask. Please give them eyes to see and ears to hear. This we pray in your holy name. Amen. All right, let's get started. So we're going to start by reading chapter 7 together. Like I said, it's always helpful to read the text in your own Bible. Doesn't matter what translation you're using. I tend to use the ESV because I'm kind of picky. I like the ESV for story stuff, and I like the NIV for the poetry stuff because I find it's a little bit more poetic. So if you want to follow along, feel free. Chapter 7. So the king and Haman went in to feast with Queen Esther. And on the second day, as they were drinking wine after the feast, the king again said to Esther, "What is your wish, Queen Esther? It shall be granted you. And what is your request? Even to the half of my kingdom it shall be fulfilled." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be granted me for my wish, and my people for my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared to the loss of the king." Then King Xerxes said to Queen Esther, "Who is he, and where is he who has dared to do this?" And Esther said, "A foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman." And Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Haman is hanged. And the king arose in his wrath from the wine drinking and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life from Queen Esther, for he saw that harm was determined against him by the king. And the king returned from the palace garden to the place where they were drinking wine, as Haman was falling onto the couch where Esther was. And the king said, "Will he even assault the queen in my presence, in my own house?" And as the words left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs in attendance to the king, said, "Moreover, the gallows that Haman has prepared for Mordecai, whose word has saved the king, is standing at Haman's house, 50 cubits high." And the king said, "Hang him on that." So they hung Haman on the gallows that he had prepared for Mordecai, and then the wrath of the king was abated. May the Lord bless the reading of his holy word and also give understanding to it. So we have Haman having a pretty interesting set of events going on here. We see his day go from bad to worse, and this is the end for Haman. Last week we mentioned that he had a pretty rotten day, but at the end of the day, at least he got to go home and sleep in his own bed kind of thing. There was some comfort there. Today gets worse for him. He's not happy. So just to recap his bad time that he had from the past couple of weeks that we've been looking at, we saw that he had to parade Mordecai around. Something that the last thing he wanted to do was to praise the person he hated the most, and the king made him do it in the most public way possible. And then, of course, we see that his family seemed to turn their back on him a little bit. He wasn't as politically esteemed as he was before parading Mordecai around, that is. And they seemed to disrespect him a little bit. So Haman's day got bad. Now it's getting worse. His pride has finally met its match. One of the ironies of this story, everybody always finds irony in Haman here, but one of them is that in the last chapter we read that he thought that maybe the feast, or we didn't read it, but it's kind of implied that maybe this feast will help him a little bit. You know, he'll go hang Mordecai, and then he'll have a good meal. And of course we see that he didn't hang Mordecai, but maybe a good meal will help me kind of relax a little bit. This feast stuff has been pretty good. And of course we see that this feast does not end as good for Haman. Like I say, his life ends groveling to the point that the king thinks that he is assaulting Esther. Now we're going to touch on this a little bit more because there's a little bit more to the text than what we read in our English translations. So we'll touch on this a little bit later, but the king thinks that he's assaulting Esther. And then, of course, in the final irony, he is killed by his pride. Now, I put that in quotation marks because I say the gallows can almost be seen as an embodiment of his pride. You know, he built them before he knew he was going to be able to hang Mordecai. There's a lot of pride there in thinking that he could just get the king to do whatever he wanted and to get rid of the people he doesn't like in that way. And I'd also like to mention too, in some translations it's not a gallows like what somebody would be hung on. Sometimes it's deemed a sharpened pole, which is a little bit more barbaric, slower way of being killed. But most translations have it as gallows. I think the NLT translates it as a pole. So little differences here and there. It doesn't really matter the mechanics of how he died. The idea that his pride killed him is still the important part that we should be looking at. You'll have to forgive me. My allergies are acting up pretty bad right now today, and I'm not sure why. So let's keep going. Last week, I mentioned that Esther was really politically shrewd. She knew what she was doing, even though when we read it, perhaps for the first time, we think that she's just being really nervous. And I have a picture of a mic drop in the background here because I really think that this is what's happening here. She's really dropping the mic, so to say, on Haman. And so one of the things I wanted to mention was that during and after dropping the bomb of announcing that Haman is the bad guy that he is, Esther plays the field like a fiddle. She uses language to appeal to the king, saying things like, you know, if I have found favor to you, you know, if the king the king is pleased through me, like these things that you know, she's putting herself down to bring the king up a little bit. You know, she's buttering the toast. She's sweetening the tea a little bit in order to convince the king of what's happening. And she even goes so far to say that if it was less than genocide, she would have stayed silent. If it meant just slavery of the Jews, she wouldn't have said anything. If it meant, you know, anything less than genocide, she would have stayed silent. But because this is as drastic as it is, and because it's going to include her, this is the important key detail that some people miss, is that the king doesn't know that Esther is a Jew. So when she brings these things out, she's saying, you know, these things are going to happen to my people who are your subjects, which is a bad thing. But that also means it's going to happen to me. And so, of course, the king is going to go, well, you know, I like Esther. She throws good feasts at the very least. I don't want her to die. So she's trying to put as much sugar in as possible. She's trying to play every card that there is in the deck. Like I said, this is the first time the king learns that she is a Jew, and perhaps this helps him to get. Perhaps this helps to reject the law later on. And we're going to touch a little bit more on this later, specifically next week when we get into talking about the law. Because this chapter doesn't really deal with it a whole lot. Plot twist, or spoiler alert, I suppose. And but yeah, so in this section we really see that Esther is really quite smart. And if I remember correctly, I think this is the last time we hear Esther speak, but I could be wrong. Don't quote me on that. So let's talk about the king's reaction. So we talked about Haman, we talked about Esther. Let's talk about the king. He seems to be, King Xerxes is a little bit less detailed than the other characters. He doesn't get as much airtime. Um, of course, we see that the king leaves to think. And he comes back to find Haman groveling. And I think this is important too because it mentions that they had been drinking a lot of wine that night. So perhaps what the king is saying is, this is a big bomb that was just dropped. I've had a little bit too much to drink. I'm going to go sober up. I'm going to go clear my head in the gardens. And then I'm going to come back and I'm really going to make a decision here. Because really, this is a fight between the queen and his chief of office, the second in command. So no matter what he decides, there's going to be, some part of his kingdom that's going to suffer because of it. So he's saying, "Give me a minute. I need to go out in the gardens. I need to think about this." And he leaves those two there. So when I mentioned the assaulting earlier, I was reading a lot of commentaries about this chapter, which is what I do before every Bible study, just to make sure that I'm getting the facts right, kind of thing. And some commentaries think that the king, when he comes back and finds Haman assaulting Esther, the commenters think that the king thinks that Haman is sexually assaulting Esther. Now, we don't, it's hard to tell because we read that Haman is falling onto the couch with Esther, so we don't know if this is, it's hard to read. Sometimes in the Bible there's elements of this where it's read like that culturally. Like for example, we would see when a Newfie speaks really fast, we don't understand them, but other Newfies do. In the same way, ancient cultures would have idioms or ways of saying things that would imply something else. So for example, in this area, it would imply that the king thinks that Haman is sexually assaulting Esther. Whereas in our English translations, we don't really read that because all it is translating the words, not the idea of it. So ultimately, it doesn't really change the story of Esther a lot, but it does bring up a couple extra interesting bits. So if this is the case, then this brings it really close to home for the king. This is when he gets angry. Really, not with the reveal of the law. Of course, we see that with the reveal of the law, he does get angry because that means that Esther will die. But it's when he comes back that his wrath is really kindled. And so this would be part of the reason why we would read it in this way. The implication is that the king is extremely angry because he thinks that Haman is doing this to the queen. And then, of course, if you remember all the way back 7 weeks ago, when we were looking at chapter 1, when Xerxes got rid of Queen Vashti, the last queen, the point of throwing her out was to make sure that men are the masters of the house. That was the whole reason of the first law being thrown out, that women were to be subject to the men. And Haman here, at least to the king, is trying to make himself master. So there's another layer of irony that we wouldn't see unless we read it in this way. And one other thing I'd really like to mention is that the king gets rid of Haman, but not the law yet. Now, of course, we're going to see what happens to the law. And it's not the way often all of us read it. A lot of people tend to stop here with the story of Esther. They stop with Haman getting kicked out, and then all's well that ends well, and all that. But that's not the case with the book of Esther. We have two or three more chapters left to go. And there's some stuff that the Sunday school stuff doesn't really teach in these next two chapters, and it gets a little bloody, gets a little violent, but this is the way that it had to happen, really, at least in the eyes of the king. So I'm not going to spoil it for you yet. There's a lot of interesting stuff to come on that side, but there's a big a cliffhanger here for the story of Esther. We see that Haman's gotten rid of, but his plan is still in effect. So like I said, Haman's taken care of, but where does this leave us? Esther and the Jews are still about to die. That hasn't changed yet, even though Haman is gone. Though the bad guy is gone, his plans are still in effect, like I mentioned. Um, the ride isn't over yet, and the next week's chapter gets even bloodier. There's a very specific way that the king has to get rid of the law. He's pretty clever in his doing it, but it's not the most pleasant law out there. I have a meme here from Whose Line Is It Anyway? Where the question was, worst soap opera cliffhanger lines that lead to a commercial. And when I was reading this, I mean, I read the book of Esther, this really does seem like the end of this chapter is like, go for a commercial break. Let's learn about the new toothpaste that 9 out of 10 doctors recommend. Um, and then we'll come back and we'll see the finale of how the law gets rid of. Um, and it's neat how sometimes the Bible reads like a TV show. Sometimes people think that the Bible is really quite boring. I don't think it is. There's some interesting stuff here, especially once you start to dig pretty deep. But we see some pretty interesting things going on here. So now for the final question of which has been the point of this story or of this Bible study is, where is God in this passage? So when I was looking at this, I was like, well, I can't really talk about, fasting or anything like that. We've already talked about that. We've already talked about pride before a couple weeks ago. And I was really thinking that we have a lot of the same material as we do last week. And that makes sense because these are some of the main themes in that of Esther, some of the most important issues within it. So I wanted to dig a little bit deeper. And I asked the question, where do we go from there then? If we've already talked about some of the main themes of God in Esther, where do we go from there? And I mentioned that sometimes we can finish a job, but realize that there's a far deeper problem at work. So for example, Haman is gone. That job is done. Like I said, VeggieTales, the story of Esther, ends when Haman gets rid of. But the law is still there. There's a deeper problem at issue here. The law has already been signed. Sure, the immediate problem is done. You fix the drain in the sink, only to realize that you have a pipe backed up somewhere and it bursts all over the floor. There's a deeper thing at work here. So one of the themes of this study has been looking at ourselves and seeing how the characters mirror or challenge us. Last week I talked about Haman's pride and about how sometimes we as a people can be prideful of things without even realizing it, which is sometimes quite dangerous. We've also talked about Esther and her trust in God and in her people and stuff like that. These are ways that we can relate to the characters of the stories, even though we're not ancient Persians and Israelites. So like I said, one of the themes of the study has been looking at ourselves and seeing how the characters mirror us. And sometimes this is just superficial. And I mean, I can guarantee you some of the people who have been listening to this study have, listened to it and said, oh yes, Pastor, that's really good. I'll try not to be as prideful anymore. And I'll be completely honest, I've done that before too. That's not, I'm not calling anybody out here. But we need to realize that a lot of these issues are more than superficial. Sometimes we need to really dig open the well that we really wish we didn't have to dig open. So I pose the question, what do we do when the problem runs deeper? What do we do when there's a problem in our life that, day to day we can fix it, by doing specific habits or addictions or whatever, and we can ignore it. But what do we do when it runs deeper than that? What do we do when one day the superficial answers don't really matter as much? Where do we go from there? And of course, this has been an issue that humans have been dealing with since we were created. This isn't a new thing that we as Westerners are dealing with. But it's a problem that plagues most of us. Most of us have an issue that we'd rather not look at. We'd rather cover the well. We'd rather ignore it day to day or do something day to day to help shove it down a little bit, like a little kid who's trying to be annoying. But some days that just doesn't work. So who or what do you turn to for help, and how do you fix the problem? Well, the issue with opening up a deep well is that sometimes it's hard or impossible to ever completely fill it again. It's the issue with wells, that they tend to run deep. But there's a lot of ways that the Bible tells us to help do things. And there's a lot of ways that, scientists and psychologists have really helped us do this. Um, One of the things I really find helpful is a lot of the promises that are in the Bible. Um, God is our firm rock and foundation. And that's always an image that I found particularly to be a blessing upon my life. That God is, when you've hit rock bottom, that means you've hit your foundation, and all that you're lying on then is God. So let's take a look at some potential resources and stuff like that. I don't have any specific websites or stuff like that, but the Bible is specific that Christians are supposed to be communal people. Fellowship is extremely important. It's enforced through communion, which we are told to do in fellowship with one another. The early church was really big on fellowship, being together. The Bible says where two or more of you or three or more of you are gathered together, I will be there too. There's a real strong connection with being together in fellowship with one another that runs throughout the Bible. And this can help us too. One of the big issues with the pandemic is that it's forced us to not have fellowship anymore. And I think this has hurt us quite a bit. On Sunday when we were in person again, one of the best things I ever saw was people looking around and talking with one another, and even though people had masks on, I could see that they were smiling underneath of it. This is something that we've missed. This is something that helps fix our problems. Also, another thing is talking to somebody about it. Of course, not everybody is fantastic with helping dealing with problems. Trust me, I know. I've dealt with a couple people like that before. But that doesn't mean that they mean anything by it either. I want to throw that out there. Some people try and help you. They don't necessarily help you, but the fact that they're trying sometimes can be helpful. Talk to your pastor about it. Me and Eva are capable. We're willing to bend an ear to your troubles if you need us. And also the other people in the church as well. It's really important that in times of stress and of hardship that we don't rely on ourselves. That's often the way that a lot of these problems arise, is being alone and trying to deal with the issue yourself. The important thing is that we talk to one another. I can't promise to be a magic cure-all. I know Eva can't promise that either. I know no pastor can promise to be a magic cure-all because we're not the ones doing the helping. It's really God working through us to help people. Ultimately, God is the greatest healer. Now, of course, I can't speak to some issues, incredible mental illness or incredible physical health. I can't really give advice on because I'm not a doctor or a psychiatrist. But when it comes to issues of faith or spirituality or even just trying to figure out who we are, what the meaning of life is, I can't promise to give you direct answers. I know you've heard me say it before, but one of the marks of a good pastor is being able to give long answers to short questions. And these are some of the things that we have to deal with as people. Some of these short questions are the most important. Sometimes we want a short answer to these, that way we can get it over with faster. But that's not really how that works. We sometimes, in order to get rid of the hole, the first thing you need to do is to look at the hole. We need to get rid of the law as well as getting rid of the Haman. So I hope this has been interesting at the very least. I'm really enjoying this look at Esther. I think we only have 2 weeks left of Esther, 2 or 3. If we can meet in person next week, one of the things we're going to do is we're going to do a vote on all of the options of the next books or next topics. I love the Old Testament. I love the New Testament. We can choose another book to start looking through. I can't believe we've already gone through most of Esther. I've also toyed with the idea of having a week by week topic series. So, we can do a series on misconceptions, talk about stuff like specific topics that people don't really understand. Like, let's talk about angels and demons, or let's talk about time, because the Bible is kind of weird on that, or let's talk about how the Bible was written. All these things that a lot of people, you can find some answers using a quick Google search, but a lot of those answers aren't often right. Um, and of course, we would do that so that I'd pass around a paper where people could put topics in a hat, kind of thing. We'd work on it week by week, but we'll work through that when we're back in person again, because I want to see what you guys are interested in. So, God bless. I hope you got something out of it. If you ever need anything, you can always contact me or Eva, or any other pastor in the area, or best friends, or just try and get back together again. I'm not advocating being dangerous about anything, but I'm saying that it's important not to shut yourself in. It's important to get to see each other these days, as well. It's one of the things that the Bible calls us to do. So, God bless. Have a good week.